Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started since we are at the 10 o'clock hour. My name is Jenny Reilly. I am a counselor with Preferred EAP. And today's presentation is titled From Knowing to Doing, How to Initiate Change and Stick with It. And the motivation for this webinar kind of came from, I was speaking with a lot of healthcare professionals and I was hearing a lot of the same thing, which is that I know what I should be doing. I know what's good for me. I know what would help, but I'm having a lot of trouble actually following through with doing it. So that prompted me to read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. And this presentation is largely based on his book. And I thought it would be helpful because making change is really hard. And especially now, I just feel like there's a heaviness in society outside of personal issues, and that makes it challenging to kind of create new habits. So hopefully this presentation will help with that. My colleague Tyler is on the call and he's going to help with moving the slides along. But if you have any questions that come up as I'm talking, please feel free to type them into the chat, into the question tab, and then we can address them at the end. I'm going to try to end about 15 minutes early so that we can have some time to have discussion if necessary. Next slide. So today's goals are to first normalize the challenges associated with making lasting change. It's challenging. It's pretty much challenging for everybody, and I just kind of want to talk about some of the reasons of why that is. And for you personally, if you have certain goals in mind, I'm hoping as we move through this presentation, you can kind of consider what were the typical pitfalls, where were the areas that kind of made you fall off before, and hopefully plan ahead on how to avoid them moving forward. And then of course, we're going to discuss practical strategies for making that lasting change. Next slide. So when I'm talking about making changes, I'm primarily talking about changes in one of these categories. This is the different pillars of well-being. When we talk about wellness, we're kind of talking about all of these different categories. So there's sleep, emotional regulation, mindfulness, movement and breathing, nutrition, relationships, laughter, and spirituality. And when thinking about goal setting, it's kind of good to have these categories in mind so that you can feel like you're living a balanced life when it comes to wellness. Next slide. So I wanted to start off just with polling you guys about what's the biggest barrier that you've had to making change. I kind of just wanted to see if if many of us had the same barrier or if there was a lot of variety. So if you could go to at the top, it tells you to go to www.menti.com and use that code up there, and then you can type in what your biggest barrier is. Yeah, okay, great. So making it fit into your schedule is one that's up there. That's a really big one, especially because so many people's schedule is so busy. Feeling like you're stuck in the old habits, how to get out of those, absolutely. Sticking with it and consistency, we're going to talk about that today. How do you stick with something? Having a lack of motivation, I think that's huge. Like you might know that something is going to probably help you in the long run, but you just don't have the motivation to do it in the moment. We're going to talk about that as well. Fear, yeah. Fear of making a change, that can be really powerful. Getting support, yeah. Student loan debt, I feel you there. That's a big barrier, especially if you're talking about financial changes. Yeah, I'm glad comfort level is, a lot of times our habits are a comfort to us, and getting out of that comfort zone is a bit scary and it's uncomfortable. Yeah, it can be overwhelming for sure to, if there's a lot of change that you want to make, it can be overwhelming to think about where do you want to start. I'm happy to see that you guys recognize that your old habits, even though you want to change them, that they're serving you in some way. I'm seeing the word comfort. And I think that's important to recognize because sometimes people will beat themselves up for doing the same thing over and over again, but you're doing it for a reason. And I think recognizing that helps just in being a little bit more patient with yourself and kind with yourself. That's great. Okay, you want to move on to the next slide? So why is change so hard? So the first thing to consider is that our brains are wired to conserve energy. And another way of thinking about that is our brains are wired to be lazy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That served us very well for a long time. If we go back hundreds of years, the things needed to just sustain life, like getting food and water and cooking that food, all of those things took a lot more work than they do now. And so it made sense that our brain was thinking about how can I save my energy for a time that I'm going to really need it. In modern day society, that kind of backfires because a lot of what we need to sustain life it comes very easy. We have, instant meals. We have instant pretty much everything. So if we want to, we could really be very, very lazy, like not have to do much of anything. And our brain is kind of telling us to do that. So we're working against our brain's natural way of being when we try to make changes, especially changes that take work. Something else to consider is that the rewards of our bad habits tend to be immediate. So when you do something that maybe isn't good for you, like, I don't know, eat junk food or something, you immediately feel better. You immediately have that sugar rush. It's delicious. You feel good. And many times the consequences to those bad habits are delayed. So you're not going to necessarily, you could eat poorly for a while before you really start to gain weight. So that's something that makes change hard. The other thing is that rewards of good habits are often delayed. If we think about if you start an exercise program or you start eating healthier, it can take a while until you see that reward. And that's pretty discouraging. I just want to say here, I use the terms on this slide, bad habits and good habits. And I don't really like those terms, but I felt like it was the easiest way to kind of get the point across. But when I use those terms, it's thinking like it's kind of a personal thing. So a good habit is anything that helps you become more of the person that you want to be, that you feel serves you in a positive way. And a bad habit is anything that goes against the person you want to be or harms you in some way. So that's what I mean when I use those terms. Next slide. So this is a graph showing what change actually looks like. And if you notice that first, that top line, it says expected results. A lot of times when we are having a plan to make a change, we think that as soon as we make that change, we're going to start noticing results. Notice that line immediately starts going up. And then there's that line below it, which is the actual results, that curved line. So you'll see that there's a period of time when you first start making a change where you don't see any results. And I think that that's really important to have in your expectation when you make a change, that it's going to take some time until you notice the benefit from it. The difference between those two lines is called the valley of disappointment. And this is where many people stop. When we talked, many of you said earlier, I have a hard time sticking with it. And this is a lot of times why. There's this disappointment. There's this feeling like, I'm not seeing the results that I want to see. And this is taking a lot of work on my part. So I'm going to give up, or I'm not going to do it. It's not working. But you see that where that line crosses over the expected results, they call that the plateau of latent potential. And once you get to that point, there's a big chance that you're going to keep doing that behavior. And that's because you're gonna really see what those results are. So I think keeping this graph in mind whenever you start a new thing is really helpful because it helps your expectations be more in line with reality so you're not so disappointed. Next slide. This graph shows the case for small changes. Another common thing that I think really makes people not stick with change is that they make big changes. They want to see results fast, so they set their goal to be something pretty big. And that many times is hard to keep up on. It's just too difficult. So this graph is showing that if you just were to get 1% better in an area every day for a year, look at where you are at the end of that year versus where you started. Again, you notice that in the beginning with that 1% improvement, you don't notice any change. It looks like nothing's happening. But at the end of that year, you're in a much different spot than you were in the beginning. An example of this is thinking about an ice cube. And maybe it's 15 degrees outside and there's an ice cube sitting there, and every hour it goes up a degree. You're not going to start noticing change in that ice cube until it's over 32 degrees. It's going to start to melt. It didn't just happen spontaneously. There was a lot of work happening in every single degree. You just didn't notice it. So thinking small, thinking about what can I do in terms of when you're setting goals or thinking about how you want to make changes. Next slide. So let's talk about the difference between systems and goals. I think a lot of us are familiar with goals. When we think of New Year's resolutions, many times it's a goal that we're setting for ourselves. Many times in our career, we're asked to set goals for ourselves and evaluate them. Some of us may be familiar with SMART goals. And this is talking about more than goals. What's important is your system. So people who succeed and people who fail tend to have the same goal many times. So the goal isn't what makes the difference. It's the system you have in place that makes that difference. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your system. So thinking about it like the goal is what's going to set your direction, but the system that you have in place is the thing that's going to actually make progress happen. Next slide. So when we think about setting goals or making behavioral change, there's 3 layers. The first layer is outcome-based. So that's thinking about what you want to achieve, what you want to get from making that change. The second layer is process-oriented. So that's thinking about what you want to do. That's the habit building. And then the third layer is identity. And that's what you believe about yourself. And research shows that if you focus more on who do you want to be, who do you want to become, rather than what you want to achieve, there's more of a chance that you're going to actually stick with those behaviors. Next slide. So our identity is largely determined by our habits. 40 to 50% of every action we do in a day is already determined by what our habit is. So who we are is determined by what we do. And a lot of times what we do is determined by our habits. So thinking about what is the type of person that you want to be? First thinking about that. So maybe it's I want to be a healthy person. Then it's how do you prove that to yourself with small habit changes? Another way to think about it is if your identity emerges out of your habits, then every action is a vote for the type of person that you wish to become. Next slide. Something I wanted to mention at that one too is if you have an idea like, let's say you're a smoker, you don't want to be a smoker anymore. So your identity is I want to be a non-smoker. It's going to be really hard to smoke when you think I'm a non-smoker. Like behavior that's incongruent with yourself is hard to continue. So that's another way to kind of think about that. So a habit is made up of 4 different parts. The cue, the craving, the response, and the reward. That's what makes up a habit. And in that left box, there's 4 laws to creating good habits. So for the cue, you want it to be obvious. For the craving, you want it to be attractive, something that you want to do. You want the response to be something easy, and you want the reward to be satisfying. The inverse of that, if you're trying to break a bad habit, you want the cue to be invisible, you want it to be unattractive to you, you want it to be difficult to complete, and you want it to be you want the reward to be unsatisfying. So we're going to go through each one of these in the coming slides. Next slide. So before we think about setting goals or creating new habits, it's really important to check on your system. And the way that you do this is by creating a habit scorecard. And a way to do this is to think about your morning routine. Think about when your alarm goes off, what are the things that you do every morning? And kind of rating each of those behaviors as good, bad, or neutral. So asking yourself, does this behavior help me become more the person I want to be? And then giving it good, bad, neutral. The purpose of this is not to be judgmental on yourself. The purpose of this is really to become aware of what your current behaviors and habits are. And because in order to make changes, there needs to be awareness first of what's already happening, so you can kind of know where to make those changes. Pointing and calling is a system that they have in place for the Japan railway system. And they recognize that when something becomes a habit, it becomes unconscious. And when it becomes unconscious, there's a lot more chance of having little errors. So the way that they avoid this in their safety protocol with their railway is they have a pointing and calling system, and it's each worker points out the thing that they're going to do and they say it out loud. And this helps keep that everyday behavior conscious, and they're aware of it. And that reduces the chance of there being mistakes. So that's kind of where this checking on your system comes from. You first need to have that awareness so that you can follow through with what you want to do and not have those little errors. Next slide. So when we think about creating a new habit, we want to be specific. So the best way to start a new habit is thinking like this: I will do this behavior at this time in this location. An example here, if your goal for 2022 is the difference is I want to exercise versus saying something like I want to walk for 20 minutes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday in my neighborhood. That is very specific. That tells you how long you're going to be doing it, what time you're going to be doing it, where you're going to be doing it. It's so specific that you could put a reminder in your phone, and it's going to be something that's in your schedule. People who make their goals be that specific tend to follow through a lot more with people who have a vague thing of I want to exercise, or I want to exercise 3 times a week. Well, where? What are you going to do? What does that look like? If you don't have the specifics locked down, and you go to work and you come home and you're exhausted and you make dinner and then it's after dinner, there's a very good chance that you're not going to have the mental energy to think about finding the exercise you're going to do and finding the time for it. So being very specific with what the goal is. Another strategy is habit stacking. And that's, after you do your scorecard and you kind of have a good awareness of what you're already doing, you think, after I do this certain behavior, I'm going to do this new behavior. So let's say every morning you get your coffee together to go to work. You're going to say, okay, after I get my coffee together to go to work, I'm going to take my vitamins. So you're stacking a habit on top of something you already do, which again makes it a lot more likely that you're going to follow through. Next slide. So for the habit cue, you want it to be obvious. To make a habit a big part of your life, you want to make the cue a big part of your environment. So thinking like, if you want to eat healthier, maybe putting a bowl of fruit right on your kitchen counter so that when you go into the kitchen and you're hungry, you see the healthy option right there. If you want to exercise more, maybe put the yoga mat and your sneakers right next to your TV so that when you sit down to watch TV at night, you're seeing the cue. If you want to be more mindful with how you spend your time and maybe you want to be more creative with your hobbies or something, you could put the art supplies right on your kitchen table. So you're making that cue stare you right in the face, and that's going to help you remember. It's also going to make it easier to do it because it's right there. Next slide. For the craving, you want it to be attractive. You want it to be something that you want to do. If the goal is something you hate, it's going to be really hard to get that motivation up every day to do it. So something to think about here is that research shows that having desire for something tends to release more dopamine in your brain than actually attaining it. The study was done on people who were thinking about vacation versus people who were on vacation, and that's what they found. So using that science, thinking about how can you make your desire, how can you make yourself have a strong desire to want to do whatever the behavior is. So one thing that we all know is good for us is exercise, and that can be hard to have in our life because some people really don't enjoy it. So you want to try to think of, okay, well, what's the thing that you hate the least? You know, like, so maybe you really enjoy walking. That would be a good exercise goal. Maybe you enjoy walking with a friend where you can like talk while you're doing it. That might be a good way to make it very attractive, because now it's not just exercise, it's socializing with somebody that you want to spend time with. There's also something called temptation bundling, and that's where you pair an action that you really want to do with an action that you need to do. So an example for this would be maybe you only watch your favorite show or listen to your favorite audiobook when you're at the gym. So now you're excited to go to the gym because you really want to watch your show, or you really want to listen to whatever that audiobook is. Next slide. So for the habit response, we want it to be something that's easy. And the key here is that the amount of time that you perform a habit is not nearly as important as the number of times that you do it. So the focus really needs to be on taking action. And a way to do this is to prime your environment ahead of time to make that future action easier. So an example with this would be like meal prepping or not buying sweets. You know, if you want to eat healthier and you meal prep on the weekend, it makes it a lot more likely that when you get home, you're gonna eat that healthy meal because it's already prepared for you. Next slide. So this brings us to the 2-minute rule. And the 2-minute rule says that any new habit should take less than 10 minutes to do, because the point is to master that habit of showing up. So with this, let's say the goal is let's use that walking goal that I used earlier. So the 2-minute rule example would be you're going to put your sneakers by the door. That's the thing that's going to prime you to be able to take that next step. Let's say you want to read more often. Maybe your goal is that you want to read a half hour every night. The 2-minute rule is going to be, I'm going to read a page. So it's taking whatever the goal, that end goal is, and breaking it down to a 2-minute segment. And the point here is to make it always stay below the point where it feels like work. You want the feeling to be, yeah, I can do that. That's total. I can totally fit that in my schedule, or I can totally do that behavior. Because again, the point is that you need to be showing up in order to create the habit, and you can't improve upon a habit that doesn't exist yet. Next slide. There's also something called the 5-second rule. That's not in James Clear's book, but I included this. I would hear often, especially some of my clients who deal with some depressive symptoms or who are really, really busy, that you know, they get these thoughts throughout the day of I should do this, and they never actually are able to do it. So this just says that when you have that thought of I should do something, if it's something that takes less than 2 minutes to do it immediately. Whatever that is. Let's say you're at home and there's blankets laying on the floor and you think I should fold them. Do it right away. And what that does is it gives you that sense of completion, of accomplishment. Even though it's seemingly a little task that's not a big deal, it is a big deal. And that feeling of accomplishment can just really help with motivation. If it's something like I should do something and it's a big project and you really don't have the time or you're not in the space, put a reminder in your phone. Put something in your phone so that later on it's prompted to your memory and you're able to follow through on it. Next slide. So the last part of the habit is that the reward should be satisfying. The cardinal rule of behavioral change is that what's immediately rewarded is repeated and what's immediately punished is avoided. So we want whatever that choice is, whatever the goal is, to have an immediately satisfying result. So if if the goal was eating healthy and you're now meal planning and meal prepping and you're eating your meals at home, maybe take the money that you normally would be spending on eating out and putting that into like a separate account. Now, every week, you're putting money away and you're seeing that money grow. That's immediately rewarding. Maybe that's going to be an account for vacation or something that you really have been wanting, something that you've been really wanting and you're saving up for. That's a way to make that that goal that's primarily abstaining from something immediately satisfying to you. Next slide. So how to stick with it. I think a lot of what we already talked about, what was already mentioned, is a big part of this, like making sure that it's a small enough goal that it's not something that feels like a whole bunch of work. But another big part is habit tracking. Research shows that people who track their habits are a lot more likely to follow through and to stick with it. It also helps you to see the progress that you're making. It makes it less likely that you're going to break that chain. One of the strategies is never to miss twice. So it's recognizing that life can get chaotic and things can come up, and there might be moments where you have to not do the thing that you want to be doing, but don't let it be 2 days in a row. An example with this is, if you normally walk a couple miles a couple days a week and you're not able to do it, thinking to yourself, like, can you do it for 5 minutes? Can you walk around your house for 5 minutes? That's showing up. You're still showing up even if you're not doing the extent of what the goal is. Because again, it's that showing up that's more important than the perfection. Next slide. So another thing to consider when you're thinking about goal setting and you're thinking about the habits that you want to make is how to get the odds in your favor. And what that means is thinking about goals that maybe play to your personality or play to your genes. So you want to ask yourself, what's some stuff that's maybe fun for you, but it's work to other people? What are things that you lose track of time when you're doing? Is there any area where you tend to get greater returns than the average person? Are there things that come naturally to you? Thinking of these things and then shaping your goals around it can be really helpful, because there's a chance that you're going to have a lot more success, and that success increases motivation, and that increased motivation makes it more likely that you're going to continue whatever that goal is. Next slide. So there's the Goldilocks rule, and the Goldilocks rule basically says it's really important to stay in this zone between boredom and failure. So whenever you're thinking about the behavior that you want to do, the habit that you want to do, it can't be so easy that you're bored with it or it seems like completely insignificant. But it also can't be so challenging that you don't do it or you feel like you're a failure when you do try to do it. So you just kind of stay in that middle difficulty where once you complete it, you feel a sense of accomplishment, you're able to complete it. And the idea here is that the greatest threat to success isn't failure, but it's getting into that boredom zone. So try whatever the goal is that you're thinking about, making sure that it's in that zone where you feel like you can do it and still feel good when you accomplish it. Next slide. So we're going to talk now about the opposite of what we just discussed. So if you're trying to break a bad habit, if you're trying to stop it, you want the cue for that habit to be invisible. Something that people tend to think is people who overcome, bad habits, they quit smoking or quit drinking or something like that, that they just must have a lot of self-control. And research doesn't really show that there's a difference in self-control with people who quit or don't quit. It's more that people who live very disciplined lives have very disciplined environments. And that makes sense because that means they're not resisting temptation. They're not having to be faced with this temptation choice often. An example of this is during the Vietnam War, a lot of American soldiers got addicted to heroin when they were in Vietnam. And the government was pretty concerned about how that was going to be when they came home, how they were going to treat them. And they found that when the soldiers came home, a lot of them just stopped using it. Just cold turkey stopped. And we know how difficult that is. So why were so many able to do something that we know is so difficult? And it's because their environment greatly changed. So they're no longer living in a war zone. They're no longer surrounded by other people who are using. They no longer have the access. They might not have known how to get it where they were currently living. So all of those major changes in their environment allowed them to stop something that we know is extremely powerful and difficult to stop. Something else to think about is it's easier to build new habits in new environments because you're not fighting against all those old cues. So if you ever change workplaces or move into a new home, that can be a good time to kind of think about like, okay, are there any habits that I want to kind of shift around? Because you're not going to be having to deal with those old triggers and those old cues. So going back to some of the other examples that we had before, like if you wanted to eat healthy, not having snacks out. If you don't want to drink and you normally have a wine on your counter, move the wine out of your vision. Like all of the things that are normally in temptation, move them out of your eyesight so that you're not seeing them and being tempted by them. Another example would be your cell phone. Some people, they feel like they're on their cell phone too much or that they're distracted by it. Move it to another room. If it's in another room, you're not going to be looking at it. You're not going to be checking it when a notification comes through. Next slide. So for cravings of bad habits and making bad habits unattractive, I wanted to bring up something that I also hear very often with my clients when I ask about coping skills or things that they do to kind of unwind or feel better. A lot of them will say that they go on their phone. And when they're on their phone, they're usually on some sort of social media site and they're scrolling. And they'll tell me that, initially it does make them feel better. It calms them down. It makes them less anxious, but they really don't like it. They don't really feel like it's serving them. They feel like they could be using that time in a better way. And many times they'll say things like, I don't know why I waste so much time on there. I don't know why. And it's important to realize that all these behaviors, there's a surface level craving, and then there's a deeper underlying motive behind it. Besides the point that social media does everything they can to try to suck you in so that you're on there more. Besides that, this just kind of lists through the different apps and what they can help make you feel like. So for Tinder, it's to find love and reproduce. For Facebook, it's connecting and bonding with others. For Instagram, it's social acceptance. Google searching is to reduce uncertainty. Video games can help achieve status and prestige. So really, these things that seem like you don't know why you're doing it or it's just a waste of time, it is serving you, and it's making you, it's appealing to a motive that's kind of ingrained in all of us. So recognizing that first. But the big thing with making bad habits unattractive is to highlight the benefits of avoiding them. So really thinking about, what is the benefit of me not doing this? So like an example of this would be you want to quit smoking. You're going to take the money you would normally spend on cigarettes and you're going to go get your nails done with that money. So now you have this visible reward for abstaining from something. Next slide. You want the bad habit to be difficult to do. And there's some things that you can do, like a commitment device, and that basically enables you to take advantage of your good intentions before you fall victim to the temptation. So an example of this would be if you go out to eat, you might ask the waiter to put half of your food in a to-go container to make sure that you eat like a healthier portion. Like we talked about earlier, if you want to eat healthier, like not having the junk food in your house, so that if you really want it, you're going to have to like drive to the store to get it. And yeah, you can technically still do that, but you're making it a lot more challenging to do that behavior. There's also, I want to just mention here, different things that you can do that are like a one-time action that can make a big difference in terms of one of those pillars of well-being. So like you could go get blackout curtains that might help you sleep better. If you want to save money, you can enroll in an automatic savings plan. So those are one-time things that just will automatically keep serving you. So thinking about those as well. Next slide. So we want the bad habit to be unsatisfying, and we repeat bad habits because they're serving us in some way. So the best way to overcome this is to increase the speed of punishment associated with that behavior. And a way to do this is there's something called habit contracts. And habit contracts, like there's a bunch of different websites that do this, but you would basically commit to whatever the habit is that you want to do. And if you don't succeed or you don't accomplish it, you usually will lose money. Like it will cost you a certain amount of money. There's some websites where the money will go to a cause that you're really against. So that's a way to really motivate you to complete whatever it is you want to do, because there's this punishment associated with it. The other thing that can help with this is accountability partners. So if you are maybe telling some people in your life, like, hey, this is what my goal is, this is what I want to do, that's going to allow them to motivate you to check in, but it's not going to feel good to tell them that, oh no, I didn't follow through. I didn't do what I said I was going to do. So that's another way to kind of speed up punishment associated with a behavior that you want to stop. Next slide. So reflection and review. We said before that as you do habits, they become unconscious and you stop noticing the little errors. So it's important that whatever you decide to have as your goal or as your habit, that you take moments to reflect and review so that you're conscious of your performance over time and you can make those adjustments. We talked about the Goldilocks zone before, and it's going to take reflection and review to make sure you're staying in that zone. So whatever it is, I mean, it might be that you kind of check in 4 months or something. You can put a reminder in your phone to kind of like check up on yourself. And that can also be a time to kind of to feel good about the progress that you made. If you're habit tracking, you know, looking back at 4 months of habit tracking can say, wow, like, you know, I accomplished a lot. That can also increase motivation when you review it like that. Next slide. So different opportunities for accountability. There's EAP. So I mentioned that I'm a counselor with preferred EAP, and something that we do very often is help people in terms of accountability. Many times I will have clients call in and say, you know, this is what I want to work on, this is what my goal is, and I think it's just going to really help me to know that I have a phone call set up with you in 2 weeks to say, hey, how did it go? Just knowing that they're checking in with another person makes them more likely to follow through with those daily changes. If we're not your EAP provider, just checking with your employer to see if you do have an EAP provider, because that's something that, you know, any EAP could do. LVHN also has My Total Health. If you're an employee of LVHN, or you can utilize this. A lot of times, I think actually for January, they have different wellness like challenges and with prizes, and those are all ways to kind of keep motivated and make you more encouraged to do whatever the challenge is. There's also the wellness coaches through LVHN that can help you with your wellness goals with whatever they are. So these are just, I mean, these are things offered through your employer to help with accountability, but it can also just, it could be a partner, it could be a friend. But I think always when there's somebody to be checking in on you, it makes it a lot more likely that you're going to complete whatever it is that you want to complete. And next slide. So that's it. So I want to, if there's any questions in the chat box, or if anybody has any questions you want to verbally ask or comments. Was there anything in the chat box, Tyler?
We just had one question. Someone asking if the presentation was going to be recorded. It is being recorded, and it will be shared with everyone that registered sometime tomorrow. We'll send it out via email.
Okay, great. And I mentioned that this presentation is based on James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. If this is something that you would want more, if you're somebody who enjoys reading and would like more information, I really encourage you to read the book. This is like a summary of it, but he goes through a lot of really great examples of these different things that can maybe just help drive the point home a little more. So. Okay. So if there's not any questions, if there is a question to follow up, you can always email me too. It's jenny.reilly@lbehn.org. But yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. I will go ahead and close things up. And as I mentioned, folks can expect an email from us tomorrow with a copy of the presentation along with the recording information as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody who attended. And thanks, Tyler, for helping to navigate.
Thank you. All right, take care, everyone.